The road less traveled. The road stretched endlessly before Marcus, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through a vast expanse of wilderness. The hum of his truck's engine was the only sound accompanying him as the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. He wasn't sure where he was headed. He never was. The road had become his sanctuary, a place where he could leave behind the ghosts of his past and the scars they had left on his soul. It had been years since Marcus left the military, yet the discipline and instincts honed in Delta Force never truly faded. They were woven into the fabric of his being, influencing every move he made. Most people didn't notice. He blended in easily, his calm demeanor and polite nature masking the intense training that had defined much of his life. For Marcus, every situation was a calculation, every interaction a potential chessboard. The diner appeared on the horizon, a relic from a bygone era. Its neon open sign flickered weakly, fighting against the encroaching twilight. Beside it, an old gas station stood like a sentinel, its rusted pumps a testament to years of neglect. Marcus felt his stomach growl, a reminder that it had been hours since his last meal. He decided to stop, thinking it would be a quick in-and-out visit before continuing down the road. As he pulled into the gravel lot, the crunch of tires echoed in the stillness. Marcus scanned the area, noting the sparse number of vehicles parked outside. A row of motorcycles lined the side of the building, their chrome gleaming in the fading sunlight. He took a mental note but didn't dwell on it. He had encountered bikers before. Most were harmless, just groups of people seeking camaraderie and adventure on the open road. Inside, the diner was a snapshot of small-town Americana. The checkered floors and cracked vinyl booths hinted at years of wear and tear, while the faint smell of burnt coffee and fried food lingered in the air. A jukebox sat in the corner, its silence suggesting it hadn't played a tune in decades. The waitress behind the counter was wiping down already clean surfaces, her expression tired and detached. Marcus entered quietly, the bell above the door jingling to announce his arrival. He felt the shift in the room immediately. Heads turned, and conversations fell silent. The air grew heavy with unspoken tension. He didn't need to look around to know he was being scrutinized. Instead, he kept his head down, adjusted his cap, and walked to a booth near the window. Old habits died hard. He always liked to have a clear view of the exit. The waitress approached hesitantly, her pen tapping nervously against her notepad. "What'll it be?" she asked, her voice flat but tinged with unease. "Cheeseburger and fries," Marcus replied evenly. "And a coffee." "Black." She scribbled the order down, her eyes darting toward the corner table where the bikers sat. There were 5 of them, clad in leather vests adorned with patches and insignias. They watched Marcus with thinly veiled hostility, their laughter fading to murmurs as they exchanged glances. Marcus wasn't surprised. He had seen this dynamic play out before. The stranger in unfamiliar territory, the locals asserting their dominance. He wasn't here to make friends or enemies. All he wanted was a meal and the solitude of the road. "Hey, buddy," one of the bikers called out, his voice loud enough to fill the small diner. He was a large man with a thick beard and tattoos that crawled up his forearms. "You lost or something?" Marcus didn't respond, didn't even glance in their direction. He focused on the rim of his coffee cup, his fingers tracing its edge as though the room around him didn't exist. The biker wasn't deterred. "I'm talking to you, pal. Don't you know it's rude to ignore people?" The waitress returned with Marcus's coffee, her hands trembling slightly as she placed it on the table. Marcus offered her a faint smile and a quiet thank you. He didn't want her to feel responsible for whatever was brewing. The group of bikers laughed among themselves, their taunts growing louder. "Maybe he's just shy," another one chimed in, his voice dripping with mockery. "Or maybe he doesn't belong here." Marcus remained still, his calm demeanor only fueling their agitation. He had learned long ago that silence was a powerful weapon. It disarmed people, made them question themselves. But it also had a way of provoking those who thrived on chaos. The leader of the group, the bearded man, rose from his seat, the scrape of his chair loud against the tiled floor. He swaggered toward Marcus's booth, his boots thudding heavily with each step. The diner seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable. "You deaf boy?" The man sneered, leaning close enough for Marcus to smell the mix of sweat and cheap beer. "I'm talking to you." Marcus set his coffee cup down gently, the soft clink of ceramic on wood the only sound in the room. He looked up, his gaze meeting the biker's with a calm intensity that made the larger man falter for a fraction of a second. "Something I can help you with?" Marcus asked, his tone polite, but edged with steel. The biker straightened, his bravado returning. "Yeah, you're sittin' where you don't belong. This here's our spot. You'd do well to move along." Behind him, the other bikers chuckled, their confidence bolstered by their leader's posturing. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "I'm just here for lunch," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "That's all." The biker's patience snapped. He slammed a fist on the table, causing the salt and pepper shakers to rattle. "You think this is funny? You're gonna learn some respect today." The waitress gasped, her hand moving toward the phone behind the counter. "Don't," the biker barked, his glare stopping her in her tracks. Marcus exhaled slowly, his posture relaxed, but his muscles coiled like a spring. He had been here before, in situations where tension boiled over into violence. The difference was, Marcus didn't see it as a threat. He saw it as an equation to solve. The biker reached for Marcus's collar, but his hand never made it. Marcus moved like water, his hand snapping up to catch the man's wrist in an iron grip. The larger man froze, his bravado evaporating as he realized just how strong Marcus's hold was. "Don't," Marcus said softly, his voice calm but carrying the weight that left no room for argument. The diner was silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the windows. Inside, the air felt charged, a storm waiting to break. The calm before the storm. The diner's silence hung heavy, a stillness that felt unnatural. The tension between Marcus and the biker, who had introduced himself, intentionally or not, as Travis, was a live wire, crackling with potential energy. Every person in the room was frozen, watching with a mix of fascination and dread. Even the waitress, her hand still hovering near the phone, stood immobile, caught between the instinct to intervene and the fear of what might happen if she did. Travis's wrist was still locked in Marcus's iron grip, the biker's bravado shrinking by the second. His friends at the corner table shifted uneasily, their earlier laughter now a distant memory. This wasn't the response they had expected. Most people flinched, cowered, or tried to talk their way out of confrontation when pushed. But Marcus, he was calm, too calm. It unnerved them. "Let go of me," Travis growled, his voice low and laced with fury. He yanked his arm back, but Marcus didn't budge. The pressure on his wrist increased ever so slightly, just enough to send a clear message. "Walk away," Marcus said softly, his tone even almost conversational. "That's your only warning." For a moment, it looked like Travis might comply. His eyes darted to his friends, searching for reassurance, but what he found instead was a mix of confusion and expectation. They were waiting for him to act, to reclaim his dominance. Travis couldn't back down now, not with an audience. He yanked his arm free with a sharp jerk and stumbled back a step, his face twisting into a snarl. "You think you're tough," he spat, flexing his wrist as if to shake off the sting of Marcus's grip. "We'll see how tough you are when you're outnumbered." The scrape of chairs against the tiled floor signaled the others rising from their seats. One by one, they joined Travis, their movements slow and deliberate. The largest of the group, a towering man with a shaved head and arms like tree trunks, cracked his knuckles as he approached. Beside him, a wiry biker with stringy hair and darting eyes sneered, his fingers twitching with anticipation. Marcus didn't move. He remained seated, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady. He reached for his coffee cup, and took a slow sip, the act so casual it bordered on dismissive. It was as if the 5 men advancing on him weren't even worth acknowledging. The leader's pride was a fragile thing, and Marcus's indifference shattered it. Travis slammed his fist on the table again, rattling the salt shaker and drawing a startled gasp from the waitress. "You got 2 choices," Travis said, his voice rising. "Walk out that door right now, or we take this outside." Marcus set his coffee cup down gently, the soft clink of ceramic on wood the only sound in the room. He looked up at Travis, his expression unreadable. "I told you," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just here for lunch." The simplicity of his statement seemed to infuriate Travis even more. The biker leaned forward, his face inches from Marcus's, and growled, "Fine. We'll do it here." Before anyone could react, Travis lunged. The movement was wild, fueled by anger and desperation rather than precision. To the untrained eye, it might have looked fast, but to Marcus, it was telegraphed, sloppy. In one fluid motion, Marcus sidestepped out of the booth, catching Travis's wrist mid-swing. He twisted the arm sharply, redirecting the biker's momentum and slamming him face first into the table. The impact was loud, the laminate surface rattling under the force. Travis let out a grunt of pain as he crumpled to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. The wiry biker was the first to react, lunging at Marcus with a yell. His movements were erratic, driven by adrenaline rather than skill. Marcus stepped back, letting the man's wild punch sail past him, and countered with a sharp elbow to the ribs. The wiry man let out a wheeze and doubled over, clutching his side as he stumbled backward into a booth. 2 down. The largest of the group, the man with the shaved head, charged forward like a bull. Marcus pivoted smoothly, grabbing the man's arm and using his own weight against him. A quick sweep of the leg sent the towering biker crashing to the floor. Marcus knelt, pressing a knee into the man's back and whispering, "Stay down." The biker froze, gasping for air, and didn't move. 3 down. The remaining 2 bikers hesitated, their confidence shaken. The smallest of them, a wiry man with a chipped tooth, grabbed a chair and swung it overhead, aiming for Marcus's head. Marcus ducked effortlessly, rising in the same motion to snatch the chair out of the man's hands. A single controlled shove sent the biker sprawling into a table, where he stayed, groaning. 4 down. The last biker, a younger man who couldn't have been more than 25, stood frozen, his fists half raised. His wide eyes darted between his fallen comrades and Marcus, who hadn't even broken a sweat. "Don't," Marcus said quietly, his tone more of an instruction than a plea. The young man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly, and took a step back. Then another. Finally, he turned and bolted for the door, the bell above it jingling wildly as he disappeared into the parking lot. 5 down. The diner fell silent once more, the only sounds the groans of the fallen bikers and the soft hum of the overhead lights. Marcus straightened, adjusting his cap as he surveyed the aftermath. He glanced at Travis, who was still slumped against the table, his pride bruised far worse than his body. "I told you to back off," Marcus said softly. Travis glared up at him through bloodshot eyes, his expression a mix of pain and disbelief. "What the hell are you?" he muttered. Marcus didn't answer. He turned back to his booth, picked up his coffee cup, and took another sip. The waitress stared at him, her mouth slightly open, her hand still clutching the phone. Are you okay?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling. Marcus gave her a faint smile. "I'm fine, ma'am." The rest of the diner's patrons sat in stunned silence, their eyes darting between Marcus and the battered bikers. An older man in the far corner, someone's grandfather by the look of him, shook his head in disbelief. "I ain't never seen anything like that before," he muttered. Marcus ignored the whispers. He wasn't interested in the attention, didn't want it. He placed a few bills under the edge of his plate, rose from the booth, and walked toward the door. The sound of his boots on the tiled floor was the only noise as he left the diner, the bell above the door jingling softly in his wake. Outside, the wind had picked up, swirling dust around the parking lot. The young biker who had fled earlier was leaning against his motorcycle, staring at Marcus with wide eyes. He didn't say a word, just stepped aside as Marcus climbed into his truck. The engine roared to life, breaking the stillness. Marcus pulled out of the lot and onto the highway, the open road stretching out before him once more. Shadows of the past. The highway stretched before Marcus like an old, familiar companion, endless, quiet, and filled with the kind of solitude he preferred. The evening sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the landscape in hues of amber and gold. The rhythmic hum of his truck's engine served as a kind of meditation, a background noise that let his thoughts wander. But tonight, his thoughts weren't entirely welcome. The fight at the diner had been inevitable, though Marcus never sought conflict. Trouble had a way of finding him, despite his best efforts to avoid it. As the miles passed under his tires, the adrenaline of the encounter faded, leaving behind the memories he'd spent years trying to bury. His grip on the steering wheel tightened, and for a moment, he considered pulling over to collect himself. But Marcus wasn't one to stop, not when there was a road to follow. The memories came in flashes, disjointed but vivid. A night in the desert, the air thick with heat and the sharp tang of gunpowder. The hum of helicopters overhead, their rotors slicing through the darkness. His team, his brothers, moving with precision, each step calculated, each breath measured. The mission had gone sideways, and Marcus had been the one to pull them out, one by one, through a hail of gunfire. The cost had been high, but failure had never been an option. He shook his head, trying to dispel the images. They didn't belong here, not on this quiet stretch of road. But they clung to him, ghosts that refused to fade. An hour later, Marcus pulled into the parking lot of a small motel nestled on the outskirts of a nameless town. The building was unremarkable, its faded sign advertising vacancy in flickering neon. He parked near the office, cutting the engine and stepping out into the cool night air. Gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way inside. The motel's office was as tired as the rest of the building. Dingy carpet, a desk cluttered with paperwork, and a lone receptionist who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. She barely glanced up as Marcus approached, her focus on the small television playing an old black-and-white movie in the corner. "Need a room for the night," Marcus said, his voice low and even. The woman handed him a clipboard without a word, her eyes never leaving the screen. Marcus filled out the form quickly, his handwriting neat and deliberate. He slid it back to her along with a few bills, enough to cover the room, and then some. "Room 6, she muttered, sliding a key across the counter. Marcus nodded, pocketing the key as he made his way back outside. The motel's parking lot was nearly empty, save for a couple of cars that looked like they hadn't moved in days. Room 6 was at the far end of the building, its door peeling with chipped paint. Marcus unlocked it, stepping into a space that smelled faintly of mildew and cheap air freshener. The room was sparse. A bed with a faded quilt, a small desk, and a television that probably hadn't worked properly in years. Marcus didn't care about the accommodations. All he needed was a place to rest, a few hours of quiet before the road called him again. He set his bag down near the bed, unzipping it to pull out a small leather notebook. The edges were worn, the pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. Marcus flipped it open, scanning the lines as if searching for something specific. The notebook wasn't a diary, nor was it a journal. It was a record, a way for him to make sense of the chaos he'd lived through. Marcus was mid-sentence, jotting down a thought, when he heard the sound of motorcycles. The low rumble of engines cut through the night, growing louder as they drew closer. He tensed, his pen hovering over the page. The bikers from the diner had been a nuisance, but he hadn't expected them to follow him. He stood, moving to the window and parting the thin curtains just enough to see outside. 3 motorcycles rolled into the lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. The riders dismounted, their movements quick and purposeful. Marcus recognized two of them immediately, Travis and the wiry man with the stringy hair. The third was new, a tall, wiry figure with a face that spoke of years spent in hard places. Marcus let the curtain fall back into place, exhaling slowly. This wasn't a coincidence. The knock came a moment later, sharp and insistent. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the desk, sliding open a compartment to retrieve a small knife. It wasn't much, but Marcus didn't need much. His training had taught him that even the smallest advantage could turn the tide. The knock came again, louder this time. "We know you're in there," Travis called, his voice muffled through the door. "Let's have a little chat." Marcus didn't reply. He stepped closer to the door, his movements silent, and positioned himself to the side, where he wouldn't be visible through the peephole. "Come on, man," Travis continued. "We just wanna talk. No hard feelings, right?" The lie was as thin as the door separating them. Marcus remained still, listening. He could hear the shuffling of boots, the low murmurs of the others. They were trying to make this sound casual, but Marcus recognized the tension in their voices. They were nervous. "Look," Travis said, his tone shifting to something almost conciliatory. "You embarrassed us back there. We get it, but we can't let that slide. You know how it is." Marcus didn't move. He could feel the weight of the moment, the way it hung in the air like a coiled spring. This wasn't about the diner anymore. This was about pride, about sending a message. The sound of a hand on the doorknob made his decision for him. He moved swiftly, opening the door with a suddenness that caught them off guard. Travis stumbled back, his hand still on the knob, his expression one of surprise. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his voice calm but carrying an edge that made the three men hesitate. Travis recovered quickly, straightening and smirking. "Told you. Just wanna talk." "You've got 30 seconds, Marcus replied, his gaze steady. The taller man, the one Marcus didn't recognize, stepped forward. His eyes were sharp, calculating. "You've got some skills," he said, his voice smooth. "We don't see that every day." Marcus said nothing, letting the silence work for him. "We figure," the man continued, "you're either military or ex-military. That's rare around here. And valuable." "I'm not interested," Marcus said, cutting him off. The man's smirk faltered. "You haven't heard the offer." "I don't need to." The tension snapped. Travis lunged, his movements quick but predictable. Marcus sidestepped easily, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it behind his back. The taller man and the wiry biker moved simultaneously, but Marcus was ready. In a flurry of precise, efficient movements, Marcus disarmed the taller man, sending him to the ground with a controlled sweep. The wiry biker hesitated for half a second too long, giving Marcus the opening he needed to deliver a sharp elbow strike that left him gasping. The fight was over in seconds. Marcus stood amidst the fallen men, his breathing steady, his stance relaxed. He looked down at Travis, who was clutching his shoulder and glaring up at him. "Don't come back," Marcus said, his voice quiet but filled with a finality that made it clear he wasn't repeating himself. Travis didn't reply. He scrambled to his feet, helping the others as they stumbled toward their bikes. They didn't look back as they roared out of the parking lot, the sound of their engines fading into the night. Marcus exhaled, closing the door behind him and locking it. He returned to his desk, picking up his notebook. The road called to him, but for now, he stayed seated, letting the quiet of the room settle around him. Echoes of silence. The night deepened, wrapping the small motel in an eerie quiet. Marcus sat at the desk, his notebook open but forgotten. His mind churned, piecing together the events of the evening with the precision of a tactician. The bikers' audacity had surprised him, not because they followed him, but because they had been bold enough to try again. Men like that usually relied on intimidation, and when that failed, they sought safer prey. But these men weren't ordinary troublemakers. The third man, the one with calculating eyes and a voice like a serpent's hiss, stuck in Marcus's mind. He wasn't like Travis, a blunt instrument driven by ego. No, this man was a strategist, someone who thought 2 steps ahead. He had been sizing Marcus up, assessing not just his skills but the motivations behind them. That kind of scrutiny wasn't casual. It meant the man had a plan. And Marcus didn't like being anyone's puzzle. By morning, Marcus was already back on the road. The motel's thin walls and restless energy hadn't allowed much sleep, but that wasn't unusual. He had learned long ago to function on minimal rest. As the sun rose, painting the sky in shades of lavender and gold, he drove west, the truck's engine a steady companion. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. He stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of a small town. The place was barely more than a shack with a couple of rusted pumps and a hand-painted sign that read Buddy's Gas. An older man sat on a stool near the entrance, his weathered face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. He watched Marcus with a kind of detached curiosity as he stepped out of the truck and began filling the tank. "Passing through?" the man asked, his voice gravelly but not unfriendly. Marcus nodded. "Something like that." The man tipped his hat back, squinting against the morning sun. "Not many folks take this route anymore. Most stick to the highways." "I prefer the quiet," Marcus replied, his tone neutral. The old man chuckled. "Quiet's good until it ain't." Marcus glanced at him, reading the subtext in his words. There was something knowing in the man's eyes, a hint that he had seen his share of trouble. But Marcus didn't pry. He paid for the gas, thanked the man, and drove off. The road took him deeper into the countryside, where rolling hills and dense forests replaced the flat, open plains. He passed through small towns that seemed frozen in time, places where the biggest event of the week was Friday night football, and the local diner served as the community hub. Marcus liked these places. They were simple, unpretentious. But simplicity didn't mean safety. He knew that better than most. By midday, he found himself in another diner, this one perched on the edge of a scenic overlook. The view was breathtaking, miles of green valleys stretching out beneath a cloudless sky. Marcus took a seat by the window, ordering a sandwich and coffee from a cheerful waitress who didn't seem to notice the quiet intensity he carried. He was halfway through his meal when he saw them. 3 motorcycles pulled into the gravel lot, their engines loud enough to draw the attention of everyone in the diner. Marcus's jaw tightened as he recognized 2 of the riders. Travis and the wiry man were back, but the third figure was new. A younger man with a shaved head and a confident swagger. The group dismounted and walked into the diner, their boots scuffing against the tile floor. Conversations died down, replaced by a hushed tension. The bikers scanned the room, and when they spotted Marcus, Travis smirked. Well, Travis drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like we found our friend again." Marcus didn't react. He sipped his coffee, his gaze steady but disinterested. The waitress froze mid-step, her tray wobbling precariously in her hands. "Is there a problem?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but with an edge that cut through the room like a knife. Travis approached, his grin widening. "No problem at all. Just thought we'd have a chat." The younger biker stepped forward, his eyes sharp and predatory. "You made quite an impression back at the motel," he said. "Word travels fast." Marcus studied him, noting the way he held himself, balanced, ready. This one wasn't just muscle. He had training, maybe not formal, but enough to make him dangerous. "I'm not interested in conversations," Marcus said simply, setting his coffee cup down. Travis laughed, the sound grating. "See, that's your problem. You think you're better than us." "I don't think about you at all," Marcus replied, his voice as steady as a metronome. The room held its breath. The younger biker moved first, his hand darting toward Marcus's shoulder. But Marcus was already in motion, his instincts honed to react before his mind fully registered the threat. He shifted his weight, catching the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The biker let out a grunt of pain as Marcus drove him backward, slamming him against the edge of the counter. Travis lunged next, his movements fueled by anger rather than strategy. Marcus sidestepped, delivering a swift elbow to the man's ribs. Travis stumbled, clutching his side, and fell into a booth. The wiry biker hesitated, his confidence faltering as he watched his companions fall. Marcus turned to him, his expression calm but unyielding. "Do you really want to do this?" The man swallowed hard, his bravado crumbling. He stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. "I'm out," he muttered, backing toward the door. The younger biker struggled to his feet, his eyes burning with rage. "This isn't over," he hissed. Marcus didn't respond. He watched as the three men regrouped and stumbled out of the diner. Their motorcycles roared to life, the sound fading into the distance as they sped away. The waitress approached cautiously, her eyes wide. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus nodded. "I'm fine." The other patrons murmured among themselves, their shock palpable. Marcus ignored them. He left cash on the table, enough to cover his meal, and then some, and walked out. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Marcus stood by his truck for a moment, scanning the horizon. He didn't know who the younger biker was, but he knew this wasn't the end of it. The man's parting words lingered in his mind, a promise of escalation. Marcus climbed into his truck, the engine rumbling to life. The road stretched out before him, infinite and uncertain. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready for it. He always was. The gathering storm. Marcus drove through the open countryside, his hand steady on the wheel and his mind sharper than ever. The encounters with the bikers had evolved from a nuisance to something darker, more calculated. He didn't like where this was heading. Men like Travis didn't have the fortitude to hold grudges this long, which meant someone else was pulling the strings. Someone who wasn't just looking to settle a bruised ego, but had a deeper purpose, one Marcus needed to uncover. The sun dipped low, bathing the landscape in a warm golden hue. Marcus allowed himself a moment to appreciate the quiet beauty of the scenery, even as his mind calculated the risks ahead. Trouble wasn't a question of if, but when. And when it came, he intended to be ready. By nightfall, Marcus found himself on the outskirts of a small, unremarkable town. The kind of place where people knew everyone's business and strangers weren't just noticed, they were remembered. He pulled into a motel parking lot, the neon sign flickering weakly against the darkening sky. It wasn't much, but it would serve as a place to regroup and think. The motel's office was empty save for a middle-aged man slumped behind the counter, flipping through an old magazine. He barely glanced up as Marcus approached. "Room for the night?" the man asked, his tone bored. Marcus nodded, sliding cash across the counter. "How's the town?" The man snorted, his lips twisting into a wry smile. "Quiet. Usually." Marcus caught the faint emphasis on the last word but didn't press. He took the key and made his way to the room, his senses on high alert. The air felt heavier here, the kind of atmosphere that spoke of things lurking beneath the surface. The room was basic: a bed, a desk, and a television that hummed faintly even when off. Marcus tossed his bag onto the bed and sat at the desk, pulling out his notebook. He flipped through its pages, filled with precise notes, sketches, and strategies. His mind worked methodically, piecing together what he knew about the bikers and their intentions. The younger biker was the linchpin. His confidence and calculated movements suggested a background in something more structured than bar brawls. Travis and his crew were followers, not leaders. That left the question: who was the man pulling their strings? Marcus's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was soft but deliberate, a sound that didn't belong in a place like this. He moved silently to the side of the door, his hand instinctively reaching for the small blade he kept in his boot. "Who is it?" Marcus asked, his voice steady. A pause. Then a woman's voice replied, "I'm looking for Marcus. It's important." Marcus frowned, his grip tightening on the blade. Few people knew his name, and fewer still had reason to seek him out. "What do you want?" "I can help you," the woman said, "but you need to let me in before they find out I'm here." Marcus hesitated. The voice was calm, but there was an undercurrent of urgency. He opened the door a crack, enough to see a woman in her early 30s standing in the dim light. She was dressed in a leather jacket and jeans, her hair tied back in a practical braid. Her eyes were sharp, assessing him as much as he was assessing her. "Who are you?" Marcus asked. "Call me Leela," she said. "I know about the bikers, and I know you're not just some drifter." Marcus opened the door fully but didn't step aside. "Start talking." Leela stepped into the room, her movements precise and controlled. She glanced around, her gaze lingering on Marcus's notebook before settling on him. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," she said, "and they're not going to stop until you're either dead or working for them." Marcus's expression didn't change. "Who's they?" Leela crossed her arms, leaning against the desk. "The Iron Serpents. They're not your average biker gang. They run everything from arms smuggling to hired muscle operations. Travis and his crew are small time, but they're part of something bigger." "And you?" Marcus asked. "What's your connection?" Leela hesitated, her jaw tightening. "I used to run with them, until I realized what they were really about." Marcus studied her, noting the tension in her posture, the way her fingers tapped lightly against her arm. She was telling the truth, or at least part of it. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Because I've seen what they do to people who cross them," she said, her voice softening. "And I don't think you're the type to back down." "You're right," Marcus said. "I'm not." Leela nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Then you're going to need some help." Over the next hour, Leela filled in the blanks. The Iron Serpents operated like a shadow network, their influence stretching far beyond what most people realized. They didn't just run drugs and guns, they controlled information, leveraging it to manipulate people and situations to their advantage. The younger biker, whom Leela identified as Kane, was one of their enforcers. He was smart, ruthless, and utterly loyal to the Serpent's leader, a man known only as Vance. "Vance doesn't like loose ends," Leela said, "and he definitely doesn't like someone making his people look weak." Marcus leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "So what's your angle? Why help me?" "Because I want out," Leela admitted. "And the only way to do that is to take them down." Marcus's gaze narrowed. "That's a dangerous goal." "I'm aware," she said, her voice steady. "But I can't do it alone. And you're the first person I've met who might actually stand a chance." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of engines in the distance. Marcus stood, moving to the window. 3 motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their riders dismounting with purpose. Kane was among them, his movements sharp and deliberate. Beside him was Travis, his usual swagger now tinged with unease. The third man was a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding an air of quiet menace. "They found me," Leela said, her voice tight. "No," Marcus replied, his tone calm. "They found me." He turned to her. "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't come out unless I tell you." Leela hesitated but nodded, her eyes betraying her fear. Marcus grabbed his blade and stepped outside, the cool night air bracing against his skin. Kane stepped forward, his expression cold and calculating. "You're making this harder than it has to be," he said. "Just come with us, and no one else has to get hurt." Marcus didn't reply. He scanned the group, noting their stances, their tells. He wasn't just looking at them, he was reading them, calculating their next moves. "I gave you a chance to walk away," Marcus said finally. "This is your last one." Kane smirked. "You're outnumbered." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Am I?" The question hung in the air, a challenge and a warning. The bikers didn't realize it yet, but the storm they'd brought to Marcus's door was about to break. and they were woefully unprepared for what lay ahead. The reckoning. The tension in the motel parking lot was as thick as the night air. Marcus stood in the faint glow of the motel's neon sign, his posture calm but deliberate. Kane, Travis, and the third biker watched him, their confidence buoyed by their numbers. The hum of their motorcycles, still cooling, punctuated the silence, a reminder of the raw power they believed they wielded. Marcus, however, had been here before. He had faced worse odds in darker places, and he understood the power of perception. To his adversaries, he was just one man against three. What they couldn't see, what they wouldn't understand until it was too late, was that Marcus was never alone in a fight. He carried with him years of training, a mastery of his environment, and a mind honed for combat. Kane stepped forward, his boots crunching against the gravel. His eyes narrowed as he studied Marcus, searching for a weakness. "You've been a thorn in our side," he said, his tone low and measured. "It's time we settled this." Marcus didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was an answer in itself, a refusal to play into Kane's game. Instead, he shifted slightly, angling his body to ensure he had a clear view of all three men. He noted their positions, their stances, and the way Travis's hand hovered near his waist, where a knife was likely concealed. "You think you're untouchable," Kane continued, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't some bar fight, old man. You're out of your depth." Marcus's lips quirked into a faint, humorless smile. "You're not the first person to say that." The subtle taunt hit its mark. Kane's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flash of irritation. He glanced at Travis and the third biker, nodding once. They moved to flank Marcus, their steps slow and deliberate. Inside the motel room, Leela watched from the edge of the window, her breath catching as she saw the bikers close in. She clutched a heavy flashlight in her hand, a makeshift weapon in case the fight spilled inside. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but something kept her rooted in place. Marcus didn't seem afraid. In fact, he looked almost bored. That calm unnerved her more than the bikers did. Travis moved first, lunging with a blade that gleamed under the pale light. The strike was fast, but not fast enough. Marcus sidestepped with practiced ease, grabbing Travis's wrist and twisting it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground as Travis let out a grunt of pain. Before he could recover, Marcus drove an elbow into his ribs, sending him sprawling to the gravel. Kane reacted instantly, closing the distance between them with surprising speed. He swung a fist, but Marcus ducked, using Kane's momentum against him. A quick sweep of Marcus's leg sent Kane off balance, but the enforcer recovered quickly, his face twisted in frustration. The third biker, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, charged in, aiming to overpower Marcus with sheer force. Marcus anticipated the move, stepping back just enough to avoid the full brunt of the attack. He countered with a precise strike to the man's knee, forcing him to stagger. A follow-up blow to the side of his head sent the man crashing to the ground. Kane straightened, brushing dust off his jacket, his eyes narrowing. "You're good," he admitted, his voice laced with grudging respect. "But you're just one man." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "You sure about that?" Kane's brow furrowed, his confusion deepening as Marcus glanced toward the shadows. Before Kane could process the shift in Marcus's demeanor, the sound of tires screeching broke the stillness. A truck barreled into the parking lot, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The vehicle came to a stop, and two figures stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered men with no-nonsense expressions. Marcus didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He recognized them by the way they moved, by the way they carried themselves. They were old friends, men he hadn't seen in years, but knew he could still count on. Kane's confidence wavered. "Who the hell are they?" "Friends," Marcus said simply. The two men approached, their movements synchronized, as if they were still operating on the unspoken cues forged in the crucible of combat. One of them, a grizzled man with a scar running down his cheek, addressed Marcus with a faint smirk. "Figured you could use some backup." "Always appreciated," Marcus replied. Kane's jaw tightened. The odds had shifted dramatically, and he knew it. But retreat wasn't an option. Not for someone like him. He signaled to Travis and the third biker, who scrambled to their feet, their expressions a mix of pain and determination. "This isn't over," Kane growled. Marcus stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "It is if you walk away now." Kane hesitated, his gaze darting between Marcus and the two newcomers. He clenched his fists, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he nodded once, a sharp, jerking motion. "Let's go." The bikers retreated to their motorcycles, their movements stiff and reluctant. Engines roared to life, and one by one, they sped off into the night, leaving the parking lot in silence. Marcus turned to his friends, his posture relaxing slightly. "What brought you here?" The man with the scar chuckled. "Heard some chatter about a guy who took down a group of serpents at a diner. Figured it sounded like you." Marcus shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You always did have a knack for showing up at the right time." The other man, quiet but imposing, clapped Marcus on the shoulder. "You're not done with this, are you?" "No," Marcus admitted, "but it's a start." Inside the room, Layla watched the exchange, her grip on the flashlight loosening. She exhaled, the tension in her chest finally easing. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself, but for the fight ahead. The night stretched on, the road ahead uncertain. But Marcus knew one thing for sure. The battle wasn't over. The Iron Serpents wouldn't stop, not while their leader, Vance, still held the reins. But Marcus had faced worse. And now, he wasn't alone. As the truck rumbled back onto the road, Marcus allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve. The shadows of his past had caught up to him, but they wouldn't define him. The road was long, the fight ahead daunting, but he was ready. He always was.